But he had his designs. We're going to break Russia. And that's what the military-industrial complex went after 1991. Another not-so-gentle gentleman joined the scene in 1996, another disaster of our time, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the most vile, misguided criminals on our planet, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe you'll give me 58 standing ovations like Congress gave Netanyahu 58 standing ovations. But Netanyahu's idea was at a smaller scale, while the military-industrial complex of Wolfowitz and Feith and all these extraordinarily naive and ignorant people thought the U.S. would run the world. Israel decided, of course, it would control the Middle East, and it would do so on our tab and with our military and with our support. And so Netanyahu said, we're not going to make any compromises. It's even a funny term if you know the history of Zionism, that it's a compromise. We come in, you should leave, is the basic summary, but not even we'll divide the house. It was your house. We'll divide the house. We'll take 78%, you can have 22%. No. We'll take 100%, and there's a lot of places you can move to. What are you complaining about? You ingrate? That's the basis of the idea. And then the point is that a lot of people won't like that. There will be a militant reaction. And then Netanyahu's idea is you don't fight the militants, you fight the governments that back them. So we know, of course, from Wesley Clark, the famous story that he visited the Pentagon a week after 9/11, and he was shown the list of the 7 wars in 5 years, which was a neocon-Israel concoction combined. We're going to take out all those governments, and that is Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. You know what? We've been at war with all 7 of them. It didn't quite go to plan of 7 wars in 5 years because we got bogged down in each one. It didn't go to plan because it made a wasteland of several thousand kilometers from Libya to Iran. But that's been a plan. And that's part of this same disaster. It solves nothing. We have solved nothing. And to this day, these maniacs who are murderous genocidaires and killing in mass murder, to this day they have the backing of the United States government. Not even a murmur of opposition. 60,000 dead, 20,000 of them, or 18,000 by the official count, children, names listed in the Washington Post recently. People showing up starving at food depots to be shot at, all caught on TikTok. Ben-Gvir saying we're going to take everything, again yesterday. Not a murmur from our government. Who runs it? What is going on? The American people at least 2-1 against Israel in this, in the opinion surveys, because the American public is revolted by what's happening. So this is why we're here. And yesterday was at least a glimmer of hope. It's just a glimmer. There's a battle going on, obviously, in Washington and in London. London is even worse than Washington, by the way, because they had centuries of insanity. If anyone's here from Britain, my apologies. but it's unbelievable. It shows you can lose your empire 80 years ago and still think you have it, and still think you run the world, and still think that America's your junior partner doing your mischief. MI6 is an absolute reckless, out-of-control disaster, and you look at a Starmer, oh my God, don't get me started. Do not get me started, because I will not get off the podium. The wisest words, which we repeat, and Dan just started us with, that we've heard in the 80 years since the end of World War II, were those in President Eisenhower's farewell address on January 17th, 1961. And I'll just repeat them because they summarize all that has come to pass. He said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." This is a man who knew what he was talking about. As the Supreme Allied Commander, and as President of the United States, and I might add as President of Columbia University, his most important job, he knew what he was talking about. And he was reporting to us a reality that existed already in January 1961. That reality almost led to the end of the world, actually, just a year and a half later in the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy experienced the full, nearly catastrophic weight of the military-industrial complex at that time, because if President Kennedy had followed the overwhelming advice of absolutely almost every advisor in that ex-com that was famously preserved for history through its recordings of the days of that crisis, we would not be here today. And I think people know, or you should know, that even after Kennedy and Khrushchev resolved the crisis through a kind of genius of decency and humanity against the advice of all of their military advisors, we nearly had the world end anyway because of a disabled Soviet submarine that was out of communication. And when it began, and it was in crisis, and when it began to surface, some jackass in the U.S. Military was dropping live hand grenades as a joke rather than depth charges. They thought they were under attack. And it happened to be the one submarine in the squadron that had nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and they were entered into the bay. And a man named Mr. Arkhipov, who was senior to the captain, countermanded the order and saved the world, only to go back home, by the way, and be reprimanded and live in obscurity. But literally, the man who saved the world within 1 second, because U.S. doctrine at the time was that any attack by a nuclear atomic weapon would be met by the full force of the U.S. nuclear armaments, and the estimation at the time was 700 million dead across the Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, but good reason to believe that all of humanity might have perished. And we came within a second of that. Next year, Kennedy made peace with the Soviet Union in one of the most brilliant and illustrative episodes of modern history. I commend everybody to listen to Kennedy's peace speech of June 10, 1963. My poor family has had to listen to it maybe 100 times. I wrote a book about it because I loved the speech so much. I was a friend also of Ted Sorensen, whom I admired enormously. But Kennedy made peace by praising the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, talking about their valor, their culture, their scientific accomplishments, and the fact that both sides would perish in a conflict, so both sides could be depended on to seek peace. And Khrushchev heard the speech, immediately summoned Kennedy's envoy, Averell Harriman, said, "That's the finest speech by a modern American president. I want to make peace with your boss." And 5 weeks later, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed. And about 4 months after that, in my opinion, the CIA killed Kennedy for that and for other crimes of trying to make peace. Maybe that explains the military-industrial complex as much as anything. Maybe our leaders are just afraid. They're afraid to make peace. They're afraid to step out of line. Maybe it is true, as some have said, that since John F. Kennedy, there hasn't been a president really that has been an independent actor in the American scene. I think it's an arguably correct point. Nixon is another partial example, and he may have paid the price as well by an inside job to help bring him down. I think it's arguable that they're just afraid. If they're not afraid of that, maybe they're afraid of Mossad, or maybe they're bought, or maybe they don't understand, or maybe they read the New York Times straightforwardly. The Ukraine war, the casus belli of the Ukraine war is NATO enlargement, U.S. coup, CIA operations all over Ukraine. Even the New York Times reported that one a couple of months ago. We've got to stop being in Russia's face. They know it. They know all of it. They were so kind as to post Victoria Nuland's call with Jeffrey Piat, choosing the next government. Thank you. They know all of it. They know who paid for the Maidan demonstrators. They've got everything. We've got to stop the provocations. And yes, by the way, there was no Russian demand for territory of any kind. Crimea, they wanted a 25-year lease, which they negotiated, President Putin and President Yanukovych. Not territory, not a claim. Even after the coup, Russia took back Crimea. No, NATO, you're not getting that base. But even when it came to the Donbass, they just said autonomy in this post-coup anti-Russia regime. The United States said no to that one, too. And incidentally, I'll share with you just one moment. In 2021, the war could have been avoided easily by President Biden saying to President Putin, NATO will not expand to Ukraine, and I will say so. And I called Jake Sullivan. He teaches at Harvard. It's all consistent. After you fail in Washington. And I said, Jake, avoid a war. Stop NATO enlargement. It's ridiculous. It's useless. Would you like it on the Rio Grande in Mexico, a Russian military base? Said, Jeff, we have an open door policy for NATO. Said, Jake, give me a break. Open door policy. I repeated the Monroe Doctrine to no effect. And I said, Jake, stop the NATO enlargement. He said to me, Jeff, NATO's not going to enlarge to Ukraine. I said, Jake, we're going to have a war over something that's not going to happen? Why don't you say so? He said to me, don't worry, there's not going to be a war. Honestly, these people are not clever. They're not clever. What they're doing makes no sense. They don't know what they're doing. We don't know when Biden checked out, maybe already then. But in any event, they're not smart. They're getting us into trouble. So we could make peace in Ukraine. Yesterday was a hint of it, but you could see the president is so, everything about our media, about the Congress, about the military-industrial complex, whether he has the skill or not, I don't know. But if he were a communicator and had the guts and what he should stand up and explain to the American people, this was about NATO enlargement, we're not going to do it. That would be the end. But he can't quite, he says it privately, I'm sure, but not publicly. Why? Because we're still trapped. We're trapped as Eisenhower told us we're trapped. And all these think tanks up and down the East Coast are bought the same way. It's all phony. Everything you hear about, the data, there was a report recently about Russia's casualties being X times that of Ukraine by one of the Washington think tanks. So I looked at it was absurd. So I looked at the footnote. Where'd that come from? The footnote came from the Ministry of Defense of Britain. I was already suspicious. So then I went to the Ministry of Defense of Britain and, after a little maneuvering, tracked down its source. It was Ukraine. Oh my God. They get paid for this. Of course, it's paid propaganda. Okay, Ukraine can be stopped when the President of the United States says publicly, NATO will not enlarge. He could add parentheses, it was a bad idea.
My point is something else, and that is that what Russia has been saying, and I think consistently for 35 years, is that what Russia is concerned about is not interfering in the internal affairs even of Ukraine, much less Central and Eastern Europe, but not having Russia's own security threatened by the encroachments of the United States into its near neighborhood. This is completely different. What Russia is saying is that there needs to be a geographic sphere around Russia that protects Russia against U.S. missile systems, the U.S. military, the U.S. CIA operating freely to destabilize or to overthrow the Russian government, which is a stated aim, after all, of the CIA for decades. And what Russia is saying is there needs to be space between us and you, and Ukraine is that space. So there are two interpretations of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. One interpretation is Russia is trying to recreate its empire, either formally or informally, and that it regards Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence. And I think that this is wrong factually, and it certainly is not what Russian leaders have been saying since 1990 and 1991, which is that they do not want the United States threatening Soviet and then Russian security by putting U.S. weapon systems, missiles, military bases on the Soviet border when it was in 1990 under discussion, and on the Russian border since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, I therefore propose that we distinguish very clearly, analytically, in practice, in treaties, the concept of a sphere of security that is a legitimate claim, not only legitimate, completely prudential claim of a big power not to have other major powers right on their doorsteps with military or other security agency means that could be first strike capacity, decapitation strikes, or subversion, covert regime change operations, and that big powers sensibly declare a sphere of security around themselves in which other great powers should not tread. Now, I have to say this idea, and I distinguish that from spheres of influence in the pejorative sense that it is widely used, at least in US and European political parlance, to mean that Russia should not own and operate Ukraine as a vassal state or other states in the neighborhood, and Russia should not be allowed to claim a sphere of influence over its neighborhood because those countries don't want that kind of internal interference. Again, I want to state without question, the United States interferes directly throughout the Western Hemisphere in the latter sense, in the sense of a sphere of influence. It repeatedly overthrows governments, subverts governments. It has just put a bounty on the head of the president of Venezuela. It has warships in Venezuelan waters. It has threatened Panama. It repeatedly subverts the internal affairs of Western Hemisphere countries and of countries in other places. So even when the United States objects to any claim that Russia has or seeks a sphere of influence, it's hypocritical. But what I do want to say is the United States made the distinction 202 years ago, in effect, about a sphere of security and a sphere of influence, because the Monroe Doctrine, delivered to the U.S. Congress by President James Monroe on December 2nd, 1823, said that the United States would regard it as a direct threat to U.S. security of any European meddling in the affairs of the newly independent countries of the Western Hemisphere. What isn't remembered, by the way, about the Monroe Doctrine is the United States also said, and we, the United States, will not interfere in the affairs of Europe. So it's a reciprocal proposition. That claim in 1823, repeated often in the last 2 centuries, including by Donald Trump at the United Nations, as I sat in the UN General Assembly listening to him a few years ago, and he repeated the Monroe Doctrine. That is a claim of a sphere of security. It is a claim we do not want Russian military bases in Mexico. We don't want Chinese military bases in Mexico. We did not want Soviet military bases in Cuba. We nearly went to nuclear war over that in October 1962. The United States is run fundamentally by hypocrites and dunderheads, by people who have no principles and or people who are idiots. So to this us versus them, because we're completely, like you say, drawn into this, and the American mentality is that there is no such thing as neutrality. Neutrality is against us, exactly as they say. And we had a discussion a few weeks ago because I reread for the first time in many years the so-called Melian dialogue in Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars. Everybody should read this. It's truly chilling. What it is a lecture by the arrogant Athenian to the people of the island of Melos. The island of Melos in 416 BC wanted to be neutral in the conflict between Athens and Sparta. And Athens, the Athenian general, tells the people of Melos, you cannot be neutral. You are either with us or you're against us. And if you claim neutrality, we will kill all of you, all of the men, and we will sell all of the women and children into slavery. And damn it, that's what they really did. The great democracy of Athens went and slaughtered the men of Melos because they wanted neutrality. That's the American mentality. And it's explained precisely. And the Athenian general, dripping with arrogance, of course, explaining that the mighty do what they can and the weak do what they must, and explaining that the Melians must, to survive, do what we tell you to do. The Athenians say you can't be neutral because we demand that you not be. And if you then persist in being neutral, you are contradicting us. And if you contradict us and we let you contradict us, that shows we're weak. So we will never let you contradict us. That's the logic of the Athenian general. So we're going to have to kill you if you just want to be neutral. And lo and behold, that's what history actually demonstrated.
And that is the realist case for a realist neutrality. It doesn't necessarily mean that Melos should have geared up and made itself a vassal of Sparta and then gone with Sparta to war with Athens. That's not the point. The point actually that the realists make is that you need a minimum of security for yourself in order to protect that. So when we take this example to Qatar, what Qatar should be doing is to protect its neutral space and be able to protect the diplomats. So you need a minimum of defensive equipment to defend against Israeli strikes and others, and you must not signal that you are a threat to Iran in order to not make yourself an obvious target, which is what happened, and thereby then create a sphere of security. But actually the sphere of security in this conceptualization rests upon the shoulders of those independent states that are in neither camp but want to be friends to both and foe to neither, as Thucydides called it. The question is how we can break through this concept, especially in Europe and other places, that it's either with the Americans or against the Americans, right? Because it's not what it is. We need something better.
It's so interesting. Of course, when I raise this with our good friend John Mearsheimer, people will find our discussion about this online on your website. John said, well, nice idea, Jeff, but impossible. He has the idea that the big powers just inevitably clash. That's what big powers do. They will never leave good enough alone. They will never leave Ukraine neutral. So it really is us versus them, because as Brzezinski said, and I quoted earlier, it would be a void. The idea is neutrality is like a vacuum. It will suck in somebody. So they don't accept, John doesn't believe that it's feasible to have these zones of security that keep the powers away. He's not against the concept. He just says that the big powers are locked in an iron cage where they're doomed to fight each other. And his great book, which is a great book, by the way, is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics.
Yeah.
I've always said to John, we need to get away from tragedy, especially in
every president since 1991, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump 1, Biden, have moved us closer to disaster. That this isn't just an accident of their term. We had all of the ability to make peace in 1991. We chose not to. We chose not to consciously. The military-industrial complex and the lobbies, the Israel lobby and others, chose not to. They chose not to because they said after 1991, we are all powerful and now we can do what we want. And some of our so-called leaders and strategists put it exactly in those terms. Wolfowitz and others who had the doctrine that now we can do whatever we want. We can go to war anywhere we want. We can overthrow any government anywhere we want. I had a bit of a front row seat in those days because I fruitlessly was trying to get the United States to actually help the Soviet Union actively in 1990 and then to help Russia in 1991 and 1992 with financial assistance because of an urgent financial crisis that engulfed not randomly, but a failed economic system. But when a system fails and a society is in distress, I believe you help so that you don't get into worse trouble. So I had a front row seat. I was part of an effort as an advisor to President Gorbachev to try to enlist U.S. support for financial stabilization in a very deep crisis. Then I was asked by President Yeltsin, and I mentioned this. I actually was in the Kremlin on I think it's December 13. I haven't been able to absolutely confirm the specific date, but it was around December 13, 1991, when President Yeltsin walked across the room and sat in front of me, because I was a young kid but happened to be head of the delegation, and he said, "Gentlemen," because it was all men, "I want to tell you the Soviet Union is over." That's pretty interesting to hear that in the Kremlin. I kind of pinched myself, and then it was my turn to speak, and I said, "Mr. President, this is one of the greatest days in modern history, and I am sure that my country will come to your assistance to give you help, to help you stabilize, because I know how extreme the financial crisis is. I'm a financial economist. I've helped stabilize a number of hyperinflations. You need some urgent help, even just a standstill on debt service payments because you don't have foreign exchange reserves. This is a revolution. You need help to stabilize. But, Mr. President, I'm sure that this will happen." Incidentally, without digressing, I had said the same thing as Poland's advisor 2 years earlier. And when I made those recommendations as a technical economist, General Scowcroft, delivered within 8 hours the recommendations that I made, and Senator Dole. So I thought, I'm a pretty good economist, very convincing, and they'll do the same. Nothing of the sort. Then I got blamed for the lack of stabilization in Russia by many people, though it was exactly the opposite of what I had been saying, because we refused to provide any help whatsoever. And honestly, I could not quite figure it out. I knew that the people weren't very clever, but I still couldn't figure out why. To summarize, the reason why is that the Cold War did not end in December 1991. It was only midway. Because the idea, which actually goes back to the British, I would date it to 1840, was to destroy Russia, then to destroy the Soviet Union, and then back again, now we'll destroy Russia. And Brzezinski spelled it out, of course, in his book in 1997, The Grand Chessboard, opining that a NATO expansion eastward would be inevitable, that Russia would exceed. What could it do? He actually has a whole chapter reasoning that Russia would never side with China. Impossible, Zbig told us. And I liked Zbig because he was a nice man who helped me when I was helping Poland. But he had his designs. We're going to break Russia. And that's what the military-industrial complex went after 1991. Another not-so-gentle gentleman joined the scene in 1996, another disaster of our time, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the most vile, misguided criminals on our planet, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe you'll give me 58 standing ovations like Congress gave Netanyahu 58 standing ovations. But Netanyahu's idea was at a smaller scale, while the military-industrial complex Wolfowitz and Feith and all these extraordinarily naive and ignorant people thought the U.S. would run the world. Israel decided, of course, it would control the Middle East, and it would do so on our tab and with our military and with our support. And so Netanyahu said, we're not going to make any compromises. It's even a funny term if you know the history of Zionism, that it's a compromise. We come in, you should leave, is the basic summary, but not even we'll divide the house. It was your house, we'll divide the house. We'll take 78%, you can have 22%. No. We'll take 100%, and there's a lot of places you can move to. What are you complaining about? You ingrate? That's the basis of the idea. And then the point is that a lot of people won't like that. There will be a militant reaction. And then Netanyahu's idea is you don't fight the militants, you fight the governments that back them. So we know, of course, from Wesley Clark, the famous story that he visited the Pentagon a week after 9/11, and he was shown the list of the 7 wars in 5 years, which was a neocon Israel concoction combined. We're going to take out all those governments, and that is Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. You know what? We've been at war with all 7 of them. It didn't quite go to plan of 7 wars in 5 years because we got bogged down in each one. It didn't go to plan because it made a wasteland of several thousand kilometers from Libya to Iran. But that's been a plan. And that's part of this same disaster. It solves nothing. We have solved nothing. And to this day, these maniacs who are murderous genocidaires and killing in mass murder, to this day they have the backing of the United States government. Not even a murmur of opposition. 60,000 dead, 20,000 of them, or 18,000 by the official count, children, names listed in the Washington Post recently. People showing up starving at food depots to be shot at, all caught on TikTok. Ben Gvir. And finally, we are preparing for war with China now. If you want the worst idea on the whole planet, in all of history, that's it. Unbelievable that the thought could even be uttered. Let me tell you something about China's overseas military adventures. It's easy. I'm going to give you 2,000 years of China's overseas military adventures. I'm done. There have never been Chinese overseas military adventures. China never invaded Japan once in 2,000 years. With the following footnote, if anyone challenges me when you repeat that and they say Sachs is an idiot, doesn't he know that China invaded Japan in 1274 AD and 1281 AD, and you remind them, no, that was the Mongols, not the Chinese, okay? China never invaded Korea once in 2,000 years, except in 1950 when Douglas MacArthur threatened nuclear war on China. Other than that, never. And yes, I did get an email from a very nice Vietnamese correspondent, who said, Mr. Sachs, you underestimate, we've been at war with China for 2,000 years, Vietnam. I had to remind him that the actual war ended 1,050 years ago, and that there were two wars in the last 1,000 years. It's true. China did invade a northern province of Vietnam in 1410 AD, and the war lasted for 17 years to 1427, at which point the Chinese were defeated by the Vietnamese and by malaria, which is one of the reasons why they never did it. There is a disease zone and a tropical forest zone and a mountain zone, and they invaded Vietnam 1 month in 1979 after Vietnam had toppled their ally next door in Cambodia. It was 1 month. Other than that, 1,000 years. China's not going to invade the United States. It can't. It won't. It's not going to invade any place. And if there would be an invasion even of Taiwan, which is a province of China, it would be because the United States is unilaterally arming Taiwan against our diplomacy, against our treaties, against our 1982 communique, which said we would phase out arming Taiwan. The biggest risk we face is turning Taiwan into Ukraine. And we're way on the way to doing that, because the same thought processes in Washington are at work in East Asia. It's just that the consequences would be even more devastating. First for Taiwan, second for the United States, and third for the entire world. So let me end by saying not only could all these conflicts easily be resolved, but we should also look just a bit at the process, and I just want to mention a few quick points. First, it was already recognized by President Truman in 1963 publicly, soon after Kennedy's assassination, and already known before that the biggest mistake we made in 1947 was to give the CIA 2 jobs. 1, intelligence, which we need, and 2, covert operations, which is absolutely deadly for our security and for world peace. We should end all CIA covert operations, period. Second, obviously, from the news that we've seen recently and from what we know, we need to depoliticize the CIA and the intelligence agencies. We need intelligence. We don't need politics in those agencies. Third, we need to close our overseas military bases. They serve They are hundreds of billions of dollars in 80 countries, 750 to 800 overseas military bases that only suborn politics all over the world, support covert operations, and create terrible expense and terrible crises. We need diplomacy to return. J.D. Vance explained what he called the Trump doctrine. I just want to say he got part of it right and one major part wrong. The doctrine is part right and a major part wrong. Vance said that the Trump doctrine is first, articulate a clear American interest. Good. Second, aggressively seek a diplomatic solution. Good. Then the third, if diplomacy fails, use overwhelming military force to solve the issues, and then withdraw before it becomes no, I don't have the right word, an extended conflict. Huh? That is the Iran absurdity at play. By the way, if that was aggressive diplomacy, you announce your next meeting is on Sunday and you bomb on Friday, and that's really going to solve your problems or enhance diplomacy. So the Trump doctrine, if that's really what it is, urgently needs to be rethought. And finally, most importantly, we need public understanding. We need public awareness. We need the public to understand what America's real interests are. We need brave congressmen like Congressman Duncan, who told his constituency that these wars make no sense, that they are not for American security. We need the Ron Paul Institute. We need our favorite Judge Napolitano. Thank you very much.